Welcome to the Live Like It's True podcast. Here on the show, my guests and I talk through some of the most interesting and astonishing stories of the Bible. And then we ask, how can we live like this story is true? I'm your host, Shannon Pepkin. I am an author, a speaker, and a Bible teacher. And here on the podcast, I'm inviting you to think of these stories in the Bible as containers for truth. Each one gives you a new way to reject the lies, to rehearse the truth, and to invite other people to do the same. So I hope that this episode is going to inspire you to better know the story, share the story, and live like the story is true. Well, today is the last episode in our Sarah series. We've been examining the life of Sarah, and I correlated this series with the launch of my new book, Shaped by God's Promises. And so this is the very last episode in that series. If you've missed some of them, I hope you'll go back. We've had a fabulous lineup of guests, including our guest, Carol Kent. Now, Carol and I started out our conversation last time. I hope you'll go check out that episode when God says you must lay down your Isaac. It was such an encouraging, amazing conversation, and we're going to pick it up here in just a minute. But first, let me introduce Carol to you if you're not familiar with her. Carol is a best-selling author and an international speaker for conferences, outreach events, and retreats. She's the executive director of the Speak Up Conference, and Carol and I talked about how that's where we became acquainted, and I'm so thankful for that conference. And Carol and her husband, Gene, have founded a nonprofit organization called Speak Up for Hope, which benefits inmates and their families. Carol is the author of over 25 books, including the best-selling book we talked about last time, When I Lay My Isaac Down. And so we're going to pick up the story, but let me just recap what we talked about last time. Carol is the mother of one and only son, Jason Kent. And when Jason was in his 20s, Carol got a horrifying phone call with unthinkable news. Her son, Jason, who was a naval lieutenant, had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder. So if you haven't heard that story, you'll want to go back and listen to that first episode. But we're talking about this experience that Abraham had, where he was asked to lay down his only son, and it made no sense because of the promises that God had given to Abraham. Often in these experiences, they make no sense, and we can't imagine why God would ask us to walk through something so horrifying. And so we're going to pick up the conversation right as Carol Kent is sharing an insight about Abraham laying Isaac on the altar.
It was something that was so specific to me when I was studying the passage that you just referred to, is that it says he bound his son and he laid him on the altar. And I know you and I both love studying biblical meanings of words, Shannon. And the verb form for laying your Isaac down actually means a lifting up. So, in other words, laying his Isaac down was a supreme act of high worship.
Oh, yeah.
It was a lifting up. And to me, that was an aha moment in that passage. It was like to relinquish control of my son in my situation. And I know Abraham had to do that, but it was as if saying, Lord, this is my heart sacrifice.
Yeah.
This is what I need to do to lift my son up. And Shannon, I started to think, what does that look like? What does a heart sacrifice look like? Well, it's to identify something precious to us. So we might ask every one of our listeners today, what is precious to you? So precious that you cling to it and it's hard to let go of. And it's letting go of our control over the situation, event, or person as an act of worship. Wow. I think God had to pry my hands open
Yeah.
I mean, I was not just willingly saying, "Oh Lord, I just give you my son, and it's okay if he's in prison for life." And in Florida, there's the death penalty. It felt like
Oh.
everything was on the altar. It was so frightening. And it is to embrace God's love in the process of letting go. Isn't that
Mm.
just amazing? Imagine what Abraham had to go to say, Lord, I trust you. You love my son enough that I can embrace your love in the process of letting go and lifting up this sacrifice, which is my son, and then resting in the outcomes, even if in this lifetime we are not permitted to know the
Mm.
why the sacrifice was needed. And I mean, that's a question we all ask. Do I trust God to know that He is all powerful? He is sovereign. So even if I don't get to know the ending of my story before my life ends, I will still trust Him that He knew what was going on and I was obedient and faithful to do what He wanted me to do. Those
Mm.
are tough Bible lessons.
Absolutely. Carol, you endorsed my first book, Control Girl,
Yes, it's a
which is,
great book.
well, thank you for your support with that project. But I mean, laying down control is a lifting up
Mhm,
of the sovereignty of God, like laying this control down. I can't even imagine as a mom having to give up control like you have done here. But I really love what you just said about laying down the whys.
mhm,
Like why God, and Abraham, as he's planning what's going to happen, he does not understand why.
mm,
All he knew was God had made these promises to him. That's
mhm,
all he knew. He
yeah,
didn't understand. But
no,
I noticed too one little thing that Abraham said when he's talking to the servants. He says, this is verse 5, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. We, that's a plural. Abraham doesn't say,
fascinating, isn't
I
it?
will come back to you. Yes, he says, we. I think Hebrews tells us that he thought God would raise his son from the dead. And so maybe perhaps that's why he said we will return. Maybe he has this in mind as he's headed. But let me just read that part of the story where he's actually laying Isaac on the altar. It says, when they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there. He arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to
Mm,
slay his son.
mm,
And the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up there in the thicket and he saw a ram caught by its thorns. He went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed the ram as a
mm,
burnt offering instead of his son. And so he called this place, the Lord will provide, because he said on this day, on this mountain, to the Lord, it will be provided. And so Abraham had this test and he responded to the test. It says the answer is, now I know that you fear God, right? He
yes,
feared God. And that's what I see in you, Carol. I mean, what would it look like to have deserted God in this
mm,
in this
mm.
moment? How would that have played out in your life?
I can't even envision what that would look like, Shannon, because I look back at that situation and I had come to know Jesus at the age of 5. And when I was a teenager, I literally laid myself prostrate, face down on the floor. And I said, God, I want to do your will for my life. I will go wherever you send me. I want it to have mattered when I leave this world that I lived for things that will outlast it because I want to serve you. So I had so committed my life to the Lord, had no idea that I would become a writer or a speaker. I just knew that my everything was Jesus. My everything was trusting God. And so it felt unfair that he
Yeah.
did this, that he allowed this because nothing can escape him. I mean, we know God allows things to happen, but then we have man's free will.
Mhm.
And so I struggled so with that. And I realized that the enemy is so crafty. One of the things that I think is so important in this program is that you work on correcting the lies,
Mm.
the negatives.
Mhm.
And what do we see in this story that corrects the false negatives? And
Yeah.
the enemy was coming at me, and he would say, first of all, he said, you must have done something wrong as a parent, or this would never have happened. And he tried to plant that in my head. And the enemy knows where we're weak in a vulnerable place like that. And then the next narrative he put in my head was, if you had read your Bible more faithfully, if you had prayed more fervently, and if you had stayed closer to God, this never could have happened. Attacking my spirituality. And then this, of course, back to my firstborn nature of always overbooking and over planning. He said, if you had been less busy, you could have fixed this problem before it started.
Mm.
And then the one I think a lot of us resonate with is, if you were a more perfect Christian, God would protect your family from such hurtful circumstances. Lies, lies, lies.
Yeah.
And then I got to, what was the false narrative about God? Well, the enemy was tempting me to believe God can't be trusted.
Mm.
You can't trust God because
Yeah.
look what happened. I mean, you put your son in his hand, you tried to let him leave and cleave to this new wife and not interfere too much. And so you felt like you would have been interfering if you jumped into a brand new marriage 1 year after all they had had in the beginning of
Yeah.
setting up life with these two little girls. And so there's so many times when we struggle in these areas, and oh, the enemy wants you to know you're weak and that you have no power and that everything is your fault.
Mm.
You need to say, greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. Tell the enemy to flee, to get lost, to take a hike. He
Mhm.
has no dominion over your mind.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing those, Carol. I do see so many ways this story corrects these false narratives. Like two of the most important ones that I just heard you say were, if I'm a righteous person, surely
Yeah.
God wouldn't ask something this challenging of me. That's just not true.
No.
Like, you laid yourself prostrate before the Lord. You were his servant. And look at this costly thing he asked of you. And yet this is what he asked of Abraham too. And the other one that I loved that you just shared was there's almost this like transactional thing that we can create in our minds. Like if I do it right, God will give me the outcome and so I can't trust God. I did it right and he didn't give me the outcome.
Yes.
And neither of those are really responses of faith, of trust, of,
Mhm.
faith is living in a way that we don't see, we don't understand, and yet we trust, yet we put our hope in God. Um, and, in this story, there was a lamb in the thicket.
Yes.
God did provide a substitute for his son. I mean, can you even imagine the relief of seeing that
Oh,
that lamb, caught uh, in the overarching story? We see parallels all through this of
yes.
the story of Jesus coming. And Isaac actually is the forefather of Jesus. Jesus
Yeah.
came from this line of Abraham's son. But the parallels we see, Abraham carried the wood up that mountain. Jesus carried his cross up that
Yes.
mountain.
Yes.
Uh, it's the same mountain, actually, Mount
Mm.
Moriah. It's the same mountain. And, you know, Abraham, there was a substitute, but Jesus, there was no substitute. Jesus did die. God did allow his son to be crushed because he is our substitute, right?
Yes.
And so in this story, I think, one of the things I was thinking about with your story, it can be really tempting to hold on to promises that don't belong to us, right?
Yes.
Abraham had specific promises that related to his son. He
Yeah.
knew that his son couldn't die because all of the rest of the promises would be fulfilled through this son. You and I, we don't have a promise that God will give us a nation-sized family, right? Or we don't have promises
Maybe
like that.
that's a relief.
Yeah, I might be glad for that. I think there is sometimes a danger though in claiming promises. We don't really have a lot of promises for the here and now. I know that I have prayed with you that God would spare your son,
Yes.
that there would be an escape, that there would be some release from this dreadful experience of life in prison. I'm so thankful that he didn't experience the death penalty. Like God has given him a different experience. But here I'm seeing he hasn't promised anything to us about outcomes in this life.
No.
How have your hopes, though, in this greater story, in what God has promised through Jesus, how has that anchored you in the midst of watching Jason walk through these many years in prison? God's promises are like a set of parentheses. The first one is when he makes the promise. The second one is when he keeps it. And you never have one without the other. But often there's this long stretch between the two, much longer than we first imagined, right? That's what we see in Sarah's story found in Genesis 12 through 21. God promised a son, but in this wide stretch between the parentheses, she wondered, would God keep his promises? Could he? I'm Shannon Popkin, inviting you to come find the answer to those questions, both for Sarah and yourself, in my brand new 6-week Bible study titled Shaped by God's Promises, Lessons from Sarah on Fear and Faith. Find out how you too can be shaped by God's promises in the waiting.
Well, Shannon, there is a clemency process in the state of Florida. We've gone through it twice. It's long. It involves months of collecting letters of support from people. And due to the very, very harsh sentence and the very, very tough crime, um,
Mhm.
that we have not received any relief. But I look at this and I first want to say I have such empathy and such sadness for the family of the
Of
deceased.
course. Yeah, of course.
There are families on both sides, and the ripple impact of a crime like this is huge. And
Mhm.
so we never want to discount the horrific situation that family was in. But I do know that God is a God of forgiveness. And if Jason could stand in front of this microphone today and give his testimony, he would say, I began to make an idol out of my own ability to protect my children instead of entrusting in God alone to be their protector. I should have taught them to scream and dial 911 and run when they were in danger. Instead, I made the worst choice I could make. And I have repented of my sin, and I have asked of forgiveness from the family of the deceased as well as to God. And I am trying to live my life for things that will outlast it now. And
Mhm.
Shannon, what has happened is that God has opened to Jason, to Jean, and to me new ministries, even though Jason has not been released. He's served 24 years now, but he is starting Bible studies. He is working with men in a financial peace class where he's teaching them how to budget and how to balance a checkbook.
Within the prison, right?
Within the prison, yes, and he teaches in the release program because a lot of these men will get out one day, and so he's teaching them how to be good citizens, and I watched the joy he has at getting the right books into their hands. So we launched a nonprofit organization called Speak Up for Hope,
Mhm.
and we buy a lot of books for inmates, and we get them inside, and those books are worn out because they're passed on to 10, 15, 20 guys. And so they're used and used and used.
Mm.
And we've watched Jason mentor young inmates, and my heart is filled with joy. And Shannon, just about a year ago, I was speaking in a prison not far from where we live, and it's not the one where Jason is. And I was asked to be the Women's History Month speaker. And I got in, and I found out that Gene forgot his ID, so he couldn't go in with me. And I was taken into the office, and somebody said, "Could somebody bring this lady back to the chapel?" And somebody said, "I'll do it." And I followed this guy back to the chapel. I could see nobody was happy to see me. The inmates were already sitting in the chapel, and the chaplain did not have a worship band. He just had the microphone. He said, "Well, men, it's Women's History Month, and we have a woman speaker. Here you go, Carol Kent." He handed me the microphone. Not exactly the most exciting introduction I've ever had. Not like Shannon Popkin introducing me. And I began to share my story, and I saw these grown men weeping. And afterwards, I could tell the chaplain had been touched, and he said, "Carol, would you mind doing a Q&A with the men?" I said, "I'd be happy to." And Shannon, instead of them asking me questions, I found out that many of these men had been incarcerated with Jason in another prison at some time earlier in their history. And one guy stood up and he said, "Mrs. Kent, your son led me to Jesus."
Mm.
And another one stood up and said, "I have nobody who puts money into my inmate account for the basics of personal hygiene items and postage stamps. And Jason shared from his canteen money so I would have something." And
Mm.
another guy stood up and said, "Your son is famous throughout Central Florida because he trusts in Jesus, and he helps us to trust in Jesus." And
Mhm.
Shannon, my heart was so full.
Mm.
And I realized this is not the life I wanted. It's the life I have. I may not know in this lifetime or experience the answer to the prayer that I have to see my son walk in freedom, but God is answering my prayer in
Mm.
that He is using my son to serve Him in an unlikely place. And whether it's in prison behind the razor wire or outside, we are all here saying, "Lord, you are faithful, you are
Mm.
trustworthy,
Mm.
and I will keep my eyes on that which is ahead, not behind."
Mm. Beautiful testimony. I mean, Carol, you got a moment to go in and teach these inmates, but you and I, we couldn't make an impact the way Jason can. And look at the message, because Jason's life is tethered to the Lord Jesus Christ. He has no shame. He has no condemnation because God crushed his son. Jason and you and I and every inmate who chooses can be washed clean with forgiveness of our sins. It's Jesus's
Yeah.
blood that makes that possible. And so there is Jason living within the walls of a prison, and yet living for the same thing you're living for on the outside of the prison, lifting up this great God who asks so much of us. Like,
Yeah.
this is not an anomaly that God would ask Abraham and you to lay down your son, your only son. God asks this of all of us. He asks all of us to put everything that is precious to us on the altar. And so, with all of this in mind, Carol, just close us out with, how can we look in on your story, look in on Abraham's story, look in on the story of Jesus? How can we live like this thread is true, that God does ask everything of us,
Yes.
and yet he invites us to live like it's true that he is worthy?
Well, Eric Liddell, the Olympian, said, "Circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plans, but God is not helpless among the ruins."
Mm.
And when we live like it's real, we relinquish what we love most, whatever situation, person, circumstances represent your Isaac, and we say, "God, I cannot fix this, I let go of this and I lift it up to you as an act of worship as I lay my Isaac down. And I trust you with the consequences, even if I don't understand the process. I will choose to be faithful. I will choose to trust you. Lord, I pray that you will have mercy, but I pray that your will be done. And I believe when we go back to the Lord's Prayer, Shannon, we can live like it's real as we choose to lay our Isaacs down.
So good. That story, When I Lay My Isaac Down, it's told in your book. And so I know our listeners are going to want to get a copy of that book. If they haven't, you've got a copy right
Yeah.
there. It's such a beautiful book. And there are other books that you can read to tell the rest of the story. Carol, thank you for being a faithful woman of God
Mm.
for all of these many years. I'm so thankful that you didn't desert God when he asked so much of you, that you stayed faithful, that you walked through these agonizing moments and months and years, day after day after day. I just see him. You have lifted God up. Like you said, as you laid down your Isaac, you were lifting God up. And I see that in your life. I see God magnified, and I'm so grateful.
Well, I'm grateful for you, Shannon. And I'm so thankful for this program
Mm.
where you're looking at the Word of God and teaching all of us to live like it's real, because it is.
It is. Yes. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Can I just remind you that each of these stories from the Bible is absolutely true? Rather than giving us a list of facts to memorize about himself, God gave us a book filled with stories. And each one helps us to know him and to understand this overarching story that we are all in. So I hope that you'll take some time looking at this story in your Bible. To help you study, I've put together my free Live Like It's True workbook, which includes my false narratives watch list, my story elements bookmark, and more. Live Like It's True is part of the Resound Podcast Network. For more gospel-centered resources, visit resoundmedia.cc. We've got that link for you, along with links to any of the other resources that we've mentioned in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me, and now it's time to go live like it's true.